He'll be here in a minute.
1 Samuel 17, and we'll pick up, we left off with verse 37, so we'll pick up with verse 38. I know we kind of ran a little bit long last week, but I was going to kind of go back and go over some of what we kind of hurried through, but I think we need to finish this and look at a few more things that's left in this chapter. So verse 38, and Saul armed David with his armor, and he had put a helmet of brass upon his head, and also armed him with a coat of mail. And David girded his sword upon his armor, and he essayed to go, for he had not proved it. And David said unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. And David put them off of him. And he took his staff in his hand, and chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook, and put them in his shepherd's bag which he had, even in a scrip. And his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. And the Philistine came on, and drew near unto David, and the man that bare the shield went before him. Talking about Goliath. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, and ruddy, and of a fair countenance. And the Philistine said unto David, Am I a dog, that thou comest to me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air, and to the beasts of the field. Then said David to the Philistine, Thou comest to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield. But I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee, and take thine head from thee, and will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. And it came to pass, when the Philistines arose and came and drew nigh to meet David, that David hasted and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag, and took thence a stone, and slang it, and smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone stunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and smote the Philistine, and slew him. And there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine, and took his sword, and drew it out of his sheath thereof, and slew him, and cut off his head therewith. And when the Philistines saw their champion thereof, and saw the champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and of Judah arose, and shouted, and pursued the Philistines, until thou came to the valley, and to the gates of Ekron. And the wound of the Philistines fell down by the way of Shiraim, even unto Gath, and unto Ekron. And the children of Israel returned from chasing after the Philistines, and they spoiled their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine, and brought it to Jerusalem, and he put his armor in his tent. In verse 55. And when Saul saw David go forth against the Philistine, he said unto Abner, the captain of the host, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, As thy soul liveth, O king, I cannot tell. And the king said, Inquire whose son this stripling is. And as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, Whose son art thou, thou young man? And David answered, I am the son of thy servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. A lot just happened there. All right, we last week, just to kind of catch us up, especially since we didn't record Wayne. Wayne, he didn't do that. We talked about, for those of you who weren't here, we talked about the idea that in the story of David and Goliath, that we are not David, but Jesus was. So that being the case in how it relates to our life, and none of us are facing literal Goliaths in our life. Although they may feel like it, they're not literal 9-foot men standing in front of us, keeping us and define the God that we serve. But they're things like anger and fear and anxiety and addiction and comfort And those are the things we talked about. And certainly one or more of those are certainly giants that we have or do face even today. And so as we went through, we talked about how that relates to us. And we stopped at 37 where David is standing before Saul and says, hey, let me go. I will fight and kill this guy. Listen, I've already slew a bear and a lion with my own hand. Again, it's not me, it's the Lord, and I can prevail against this guy. Because David knew what was at stake there that day was not losing a battle against the Philistines, but what was at stake was the glory of God. And he was going to protect that and going to fight for that. And so that's where we wound up. Now, we get here to verse 38, we start new, and it goes through the battle. Goliath says again, hey, I mean, you're going to send this little guy out here? I mean, this little punk, I mean, and he's got a stick in his hand, a sling. He said, what am I, a dog? And so he's just, one more day, he's just letting the Israelites have it. He's laying into everything that God had done. He's laying into everything that the army had gotten to that point, and he's cutting it left and right. He's saying, man, y'all are nothing, and you come up here with a sword or with a stick and a sling, like that's going to matter. And basically David said, hey, Goliath said, hey, I'm gonna kill you, and I'm gonna give your flesh, your body parts to the birds and the coyotes and whatever else is out here. David turns around and says, no, that's not how this is going to work. In fact, I'm going to get you and all your buddies and all your brothers and everybody that's with you. That's what's going to happen to you, but not because of us, but because the Lord is on our side. And so he begins to contrast that with Goliath. And verse, sorry, I got on the wrong page here. Verse 48. And it came to pass when the Philistine arose and came and drew nigh to meet David, that David hasted and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. This was another stark contrast to everybody else that was in the army. Everybody else in the army was sitting back behind the lines, and I would even argue that they were probably comfortable. You say, well, how are they comfortable? They were fearful. Sure, they were fearful, but they were fearful on the other side. They were fearful on their side of the mountain. They were fearful in their tents. I mean, David, the only reason he made it over here was because he was bringing stuff to his brothers that his dad had sent. So he was sending the cheeses and all the things. So while they were fearful, they were. I would imagine at some point they were a little bit comfortable because they had not made that step of faith to go say, hey, we're not going to allow this anymore. The glory of God's at stake. They're talking about the God that we serve. And it says David in verse 48 that he ran and he hasted and ran toward the army. I think that's a big thing for us to imagine as we see, as you see this mountainside over here and mountainside over here in the valley of Elah there in the middle. This little old, he was a little fella. He was a teenager at this point. He's running towards the armies in front of the army of the Philistines, and they wasn't no scrums themselves. It was this 9-foot tall giant. I think it's also important is we saw that who was in front of Goliath. Even the 9-foot guy had this shield bearer. So that was part of battle then, but David didn't afford that same, because what did Saul do? Saul said, hey, let me put all this stuff on you. And let's put all this stuff on you. And what happened? You can imagine, because Saul was not a small guy. In fact, Saul was the biggest, baddest warrior that the army of Israel had. And Saul said, hey, you got to have some armor, you're going to go against this guy. So imagine where Saul's mindset is. is that, hey, you need protection because you're going to get hurt. You may get killed. He puts on, and so just imagine, Dave. I mean, imagine if I had Wayne up here and I gave him my clothes. I mean, it'd just be hanging off of him. Now that may not be the case in a few months when I lose 150 pounds, but right now it would be that way. And so David, and David immediately says, I can't wear this. I hadn't proved this. I hadn't tried it out. I've not put it to the test. I can't, I mean, even the sword, I can't use this, because he didn't go to the battle that day with the mindset that I need to prepare for battle. Is that God's already done that. I'm just going to see this victory through. And so the same way Jesus, he had to see the will of the Father through, because it was God's will that he would die on a cross for us. Is it that he knew he was just following what had to be done. And David was doing the very same thing here. And so he runs, and I think it's also important when he slings that stone. We've all heard the story, sunk in his forehead. He didn't fall backwards. He fell on his face. And I think it's not by accident that God had it work that way, that he fell on his face before the armies of the God of Israel, because that's exactly what everybody's going to do one day. Yep. They'll bow the knee, they'll bow the head to the one true God, Jesus himself. And we see that over in the New Testament. So David prevailed against him, and he even told Goliath, he said, not only am I just going to feed you to the fowls there and beasts of the earth like you said, but here's what's going to happen. I'm going to cut your head off. Now realize it. He's got a stick in one hand. However fancy that stick is, it's still a stick. I remember, totally off subject, I remember as a kid growing up, I loved Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Anybody? I love some Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Well, there was only one character I could be. If I was going to be a Ninja Turtle, I had to be Donatello. So I'm a little bit of a geek. Donatello, Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael. Well, Leonardo had a sword. There's no swords in the woods in Hogansville. Michelangelo had nunchucks. Sure didn't need any of those, and didn't have any of those. And Raphael had these little, I still don't remember what they're called, but they're like some Chinese, like long fork, pokey things. And so we didn't have, I mean, I had forks, but it wasn't cool. But Donatello, I could be Donatello, because I could find something purple around to wrap around my head, and all Donatello had was a stick. So, but as big as bad as I was, all I had was a stick. I can't imagine that being very intimidating to all the imaginary friends that I fought back in the day. But David is walking up with a stick. You know, no matter how fancy it is, it's a little stick and a sling with some rocks in his pocket. And he's going to battle with the mindset that I'm not going to lose. We're not only going to win, but I'm going to cut your head off, and I don't even have anything to cut your head off with. But he had that amount of boldness and that amount of faith in God that I'm going to cut your head off. This is like if Hollywood or some Christian film, they could make one of those action-packed movies out of this scene. If you think about it, David, after he kills Goliath, he runs over towards him. And again, I can just see him, he's got these, like martial arts moves as he's, doing all kind of stuff as he's getting over there. And he pulls his sword out, and I can see it cinematic, with the camera shot. Larry's thinking, I don't know anything about that. He pulls the sword out, and he cuts this guy's head off. Again, if this guy is 9 foot tall, I imagine it was probably a little tough for David to pull his sword out once let's cut his head off. Yeah. But he cut his head off, and imagine so again, you got the children of Israel, an army on this side of this mountain, the valley, and then the Philistines on this side. And so they had come down. Now, it didn't say anything about where the armies were. I assumed they followed David, but it didn't say that. They may have stayed in place. So the armies are kind of down, and they see what happens, and they see Goliath fall, but maybe it didn't register to all of them. But when David gets down, he cuts that head off, and he holds that head up. the fear that was on this mountainside swept across that valley and into the hearts and the minds of the Philistines immediately. Immediately. Because the one thing they were banking on was dead.
Yeah.
Their secret superpower weapon was done. Their nuclear button to push had just been cut off of power and wasn't going to work this time. Mm-hmm. And so everything that they banked on was all of a sudden gone. And so fear swept across, and they were gripped in fear, so much so that they turned around and they ran. Now, the translation for us in where the children of Israel were on that mountainside, and I made a little reference to the level of comfort that they may have had because of where they were, and because they saw every day him come out. They were struck with fear, yet they stayed where they were, and they just kind of camped out. Is for us, if comfort is that giant that we face, here's what I know to be true is that and I know you do as well, because we've all been. How many of you have been comfortable every single day of your life? Nobody has. And what faith thrives in holy discomfort. You know, and I know there's some in here that have been through just all kinds of things that others of us haven't, and then some of us have been through things that others haven't. But when we get uncomfortable and we get to a place where we have to rely completely on God, and we are not comfortable and we don't like where we are, but all we have to do is to lean on, rely on Him, well, that's when our faith thrives, because that's all we have. Right. And so oftentimes when we think about, you know, the business of our day, we gotta get up, we gotta go here, we gotta go to work, and the grocery store on the way home, and I gotta stop by Wally World or Dollar General, I gotta pick up this and do this, and all those are fine and well, those things we need to do. But what happens is we get so comfortable with our lives, and we wind up getting relying on ourselves. We're not asking God, where do we need to be today? What do we need to do today? We've planned our day out so much that we haven't allowed God to use us in the process. And what happens is when God shakes it up and all of a sudden you don't have a job to go to, well, how am I going to respond to that? Well, what do I do then? Well, what do I do when I don't have a car? What do I do when my spouse of 35 years isn't there anymore? What happens then is when we get uncomfortable, that's when our faith will thrive, because that is the only place we have to go. We can't rely on us anymore. We can't rely on the stuff anymore. We can't rely on the comforts that we have, but we have to rely on Him. And so if any one of those, and I think Saul is the biggest example, if any one of those on that mountainside where the armies of Israel were, had done exactly what David did. So there wasn't anything special about David. God had been preparing him. I think doing what he was doing, you know, God had been preparing him. But there wasn't anything more special about David than there was about anybody else on that mountainside. But that David realized what was at stake. And that any one of those other ones, Saul or any of his men, realized what was at stake and stepped out of that comfort zone, stepped over that giant of fear, stepped into the victory that God had promised them, that they wouldn't have been in that position. They wouldn't have been there 40 days later, you know, listening to a big 9-foot man, you know, call them out every single day and not have an answer. So comfort is something we got to be careful of, rather. And I said this last week. I want to reiterate it because I think I went through it pretty quickly. The five areas that we studied back in the fall when we looked at this story was fear, anxiety, rejection, comfort, addiction. Did I get that right? I think so. Yeah. And so anxiety and anger interchangeable. So and fear, I guess, anxiety are interchangeable as well. But for fear is faith in the enemy. And the antidote to fear is not courage, but faith in the Almighty. So, fear is faith in the enemy, and the antidote to fear is faith. And the soundtrack of faith is worship. I don't care what giant we face. If we see ourselves every single day in a mode of worship, from the time we wake up to the time we go to sleep. I'm not talking about what we're going to do up here, and most of us in here probably sing off key a little bit, or some of us a lot of it, but in just a constant, just like the Bible says about being in a continual prayer, is we're always in a mode of worship. Then our mind, our focus is different. And so we're not focused on whatever's in front of us, the giant that we can't seem to conquer. Is not what we focus on, because we're focused on the one who's already conquered it. We're focusing on the one who can bring us through that. So that's important for us to remember. And I love this. I love this little snippet right here. When we think about where the children of Israel were on that mountainside, they felt rejected as well. Rejection is a big deal. We often feel that. We feel, we got to live up to the approval of others, and we spend a lot of time trying to fit in with the Joneses, and the Joneses, the only reason they got what they got because they refinanced and they got another mortgage. So we don't need to do that, but we face that fear of rejection in our life. But here's one thing that can for us in our battle get over that, and it's going to take some conditioning. We didn't get there in a day. We won't get out of it in a day. But I'm going to have a T-shirt made. I promise. I'll even see if the pastor wants to do it as a faith shirt, because I've not seen one, but I love the phrase, "You are worth Jesus to God." Think about that. You are worth Jesus to God. It'd be a good Easter play shirt, I think. But in our story, in the battle against the giant that we face, if we remind ourselves that we are worth Jesus to God, then whatever giant we face, we understand that he's already fallen. His head's cut off. Now he's still dangerous. Okay, we have to be aware. We have to recognize that he's there, but we have to also recognize that we already have the victory. And if we can get a hold of that idea that God loved us so much that He gave Jesus in our place, the children of Israel, they had no reason to fear, but don't we find ourselves the same way the children of Israel did, knowing that we've got victory, but allowing ourselves to be defeated one more day. Every day, hey, what's the report? Here's the report, and here's what he said, and we don't have anybody to go. Well, one day, God sent somebody, and He did through His Son Jesus. So now we can say, hey, we hear what He's saying, but it's falling on deaf ears because we know there's victory. We know, hey, listen, you're not going to bring up my past and try to keep me bound by what that was. By living in fear that somebody might find out who I am, who I was, what I did. I see all that's been covered in the blood, and so now I can walk in victory, not because of what I've done, not because of what we've done, but because of what Jesus has done. And the time, the spot where Saul puts on his armor onto David, that's often sometimes what we do, is we put on some armor that don't belong to us too. We put on false armor, and I'm going to say this, and to the web world, the internet world, this may come as a shock to you. It may be on some kind of shocking video, but it's okay to be naked and not ashamed. Now, I'm very glad all of us are clothed in here, but if you remember in the story of the Garden of Eden, is Adam and Eve were naked and they weren't ashamed. Why? Because they were in the right place with God. And so when we understand that we don't have to put on something that doesn't belong to us, because we already have what we need based on what God's given us. And what He's given us is His Word. What He's given us is the truth in His Word, that He said He won't leave us nor forsake us. And again, we're making a transition from Old Testament stories to New Testament truth, and understanding that we aren't David in that story, that Jesus is. And so, we don't have to try harder, because what happens is we still wind up against that giant or another giant one day, and we wonder, well, maybe I didn't try hard enough. Maybe I didn't pray long enough. Maybe I didn't give enough. Maybe I didn't go do this enough. Maybe I didn't do enough. And we become more about works, and that's what should be evidence of our faith. But that's not a prerequisite for it. And so what we have to do is understand that Jesus has won the victory over that Goliath in our life, whatever that is, and it's going to be something different. There'll be Satan will bring up something different in our life. Maybe it's family issues. Maybe it's financial issues. Maybe it's issues with the mailman. No, not Tony. He's retired, so he can. It's good. But something simple. Hey, listen. I this morning, real quick, and we'll be done. Was headed out to McDonald's. We'll see if I'd eaten at home, I wouldn't have had this problem. That's what the Lord told me after I blew my horn at the big trucker guy that almost killed me. And it was just a simple gesture of, hey, buddy, I almost died, and I want you to know that I almost died so you don't kill somebody else. But you know what? And I realized, man, why didn't he see? I know he saw me. Why did he do that? He pulled out, and he didn't just pull it in front of me. He pulled it in the other lane. And I thought, you know what? This guy's going down the road on the interstate by now. I'm sitting at the drive-thru McDonald's. He ain't thought nothing else about it. He's just rolling on. And so while I'm over here in the McDonald's line, seething, tonight he's going to be snoozing, and he ain't going to think nothing else about it. And so I had to, Lord, I didn't been through that lesson, and I'm still struggling with it. So just because we understand what those struggles we have doesn't mean we won't find ourselves battling them again. We just have to call in remembrance it. God's gone before us. He's given us victory through His Son Jesus, and that we're worth Jesus to God. And so whatever that enemy is, whatever that battle we face, there is a defeated foe. We just can't live in fear that we don't have that same victory over him through the Lord. So let's pray. We'll be dismissed. We'll go upstairs. Thank you again for being here, and we're praying for those folks coming back. I'll be coming back at 1:30, I think. So, and Brother Tony as he goes. God, we just thank you again so much for your word. We thank you for, God, that through stories that we read, real stories, real things that happen in your word, God, of battles against a 9-foot Goliath, God, that we can draw, God, some help and some hope from those kind of stories. God, to know that, God, there's no wall tall enough. God, there's no sea wide enough. God, there's no enemy tall enough. God, that you have not given us victory through your Son. God, that moment changed everything. God, that up until the moment that Jesus came, that everybody was looking forward to that Messiah, for that day. God, I pray as we are on the other side of the cross and the resurrection, God, that we not lose that sight, to look back, to understand that, God, that everything that the Old Testament people, prophets, God, men and women of God looked forward to, God, that we now have complete victory through your Son, Jesus. God, there's no battle or giant or enemy we face, God, that can change what you did for us and how much you loved us and how much you still love us and how much you will love us. God, I pray you'd help us not to shackle our own hands and feet. God, not to be gripped in fear and anxiety of the enemy and its stature. God, but to know you've conquered that enemy. That doesn't mean that it's going to be an easy trek. God, it doesn't mean we don't have to endure some bumps in the road. God, that there's going to be tribulation, God. You've promised that, God, but that you have won the ultimate victory, God, and that is what we can lean on. We love you. We thank you. We praise you. And all these things we just thank you for. In Jesus' name.